Hello there, my sleepy friends. Welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. Tonight, we venture into unsolved mysteries. And if you enjoy this collection, please give us a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Tonight, we are delving into 6 truly perplexing cold cases, exploring the lingering questions and baffling evidence that continue to haunt investigators. Each narrative meticulously reconstructs the events, highlighting the unsettling details and the enduring mystery, all while maintaining our signature calming rain and black screen aesthetic for tranquil listening. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume just a little, enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's get cozy tonight. Tonight I'm going to take you somewhere far away. Not to frighten you, but to carry you gently through a story. One that happened in a quiet neighborhood in the city of Chicago, Illinois. It's the kind of story that lingers, not because it's loud or violent, but because it's soft in the worst way. It's the story of a woman who simply walked out her front door one evening and never came back. A woman who had everything ahead of her. A woman her family loved deeply and completely. Her name was Latasha Nevitt. And this is what happened to her. Take a breath. Settle in. I'll take it slow. Latasha Morgan Nevitt was born in 1981 in Chicago, Illinois. She grew up in the Morgan Park neighborhood on the city's south side, a relatively quiet stretch of the city, the kind of place where people know their neighbors by name, where porch lights stay on, and where the streets feel safe enough to walk at night without a second thought. By the time she was 30 years old, Latasha had built a life that most people would look at and feel genuinely hopeful about. She was a mother of 3. Her oldest child was a daughter named Ariel, who was around 10 years old at the time, and then there were her twin sons, Brian and Ryan, who were just 2 years old. If you asked anyone who knew Latasha, they would tell you the same thing. She adored those children. She absolutely doted on them. Her mother, a woman named Brenda Morgan, would say it plainly and without hesitation. Latasha would never in a million years walk away from her kids. That was not who she was. It was not even something she would consider, and beyond being a mother, Latasha was also a student. She was enrolled at Everest University, studying to become a dental hygienist. It wasn't a casual pursuit. She was working hard at it. She was showing up, she was putting in the hours, and by all accounts, things were going well for her. She was on a path that was going to change her life. Not just for herself, but for those 3 children who depended on her. So picture her life in the early days of October, in the year 2011. Picture a woman who is tired, a good kind of tired. The kind that comes from juggling motherhood and schoolwork and everything in between. But she was doing it. She was in the thick of something real, something that mattered. That's who Latasha Nevitt was. And on one quiet evening in the middle of October, that life changed forever. It was October 10th, 2011. An ordinary Monday evening in Morgan Park. Latasha lived with her husband, Isaac Nevitt, and their 3 children in a home on the 1300 block of West 107th Street. It was a modest home, a family home, the kind of house where shoes pile up by the door and the refrigerator is covered in drawings. According to Isaac, sometime after 8 o'clock in the evening, Latasha decided to walk to a nearby store. There was a grocery and liquor store not too far away, out on West 112th Street. It was only a short walk, just a few blocks from the house, the kind of errand that takes 20 minutes, maybe 30 at most. She left the house, she walked out the front door, and she never came back. Isaac said that as the minutes ticked by, he began to grow uneasy. He tried to reach her, he sent a text message. He called her phone. There was no answer, no response. Nothing. At first it might have been easy to brush it off. Maybe she ran into someone she knew. Maybe the store was busy. Maybe her phone had died. These are the kinds of things we tell ourselves when we don't want to believe the worst. But the minutes kept passing, and then the hours, and Latasha did not come home. Here's where the story becomes deeply unsettling, and it is important that you understand the timeline. because it reveals something about how slowly the wheels began to turn. Isaac did not report Latasha missing on the night she disappeared. He did not call the police the next morning, or the morning after that. 4 days passed. 4 full days of silence. 4 days in which Latasha Nevitt was simply gone, and no one had yet made an official call to bring the authorities into the situation. It was not until October 14th, 4 days after she had last been seen, that Isaac finally contacted the police and reported his wife as missing. Now, there are people who found that delay deeply troubling, and there are people who understood it differently, who believe that Isaac may have been hoping in those early days that Latasha might simply turn up on her own, that maybe she had gone somewhere or needed space, or that there was some explanation that didn't require a police report. But regardless of his reasoning, the fact remains 4 days passed past anyone officially began looking for her. Once the report was filed, the Chicago Police Department began their work. Officers responded to the Nevitt home. They looked around the residence for any signs of a struggle, any indication that something violent had taken place inside the house. They found nothing. No signs of foul play. The home appeared undisturbed, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. It didn't mean Latasha had left voluntarily. And it didn't mean that whatever had happened to her had happened inside those walls. Word of Latasha's disappearance spread through the Morgan Park community like a quiet ripple. People who knew her, who knew the family, began to pay attention. Her mother, Brenda Morgan, was among the first to sound the alarm. Brenda was a woman who loved her daughter fiercely, and she knew with absolute certainty that Latasha would not have simply vanished without reason. She said it clearly, plainly, with the kind of conviction that only a mother can carry. That was not who her daughter was. Latasha would not leave her children. She would not walk away from her life. Brenda began organizing. She gathered volunteers, neighbors, friends, community members, and they took to the streets around West 107th Street and South Vincennes Avenue, the areas near where Latasha had last been seen. They passed out flyers, they knocked on doors, they searched alleys, side streets, and anywhere else they could think of, hoping to find some trace of the woman they were looking for. They found nothing, not a single clue. The police, too, were working the case. Leads did come in over the weeks and months that followed. Tips from people who thought they might have seen something or who had heard something. But none of those leads went anywhere. Each one hit a dead end. Each one faded into silence. And one by one, the people searching began to feel a creeping, heavy dread settle over the case. Because there was something else. Something that made the silence even harder to explain. Since the night of October 10th, Latasha Nevitt had not touched her cell phone. Not once. She had not made a single call. She had not sent a text. And she had not accessed her bank accounts either. There had been no financial activity of any kind. No withdrawals, no transactions, nothing. For most people who simply disappear, who leave a difficult situation, who run from something, there is usually some trail, some sign of movement, some proof that a person is still alive and functioning somewhere in the world. There was none of that here, and that silence was deafening. The disappearance of Latasha Nevitt did not go unnoticed by the media. In the months that followed, the case began to attract attention beyond the local Chicago news cycle. Her story was featured on the television program known as The First 48 Missing Persons, an A&E show that followed investigators in the critical early days of missing persons cases. Sergeant Jeffrey Coleman, the detective assigned to Latasha's case, was a man who had worked many missing persons investigations over the course of his career. But something about this particular case stuck with him. Something about the way Latasha had simply vanished, without a trace. Without a reason, made his instincts uneasy. During the investigation documented on the show, detectives took several steps to try and move the case forward. They administered lie detector tests. Both Latasha's mother, Brenda Morgan, and her husband, Isaac Nevitt, were asked to take polygraph examinations. Canine units were also brought in. Dogs trained to follow a person's scent. And they attempted to pick up Latasha's trail from the last known location. But even with all of that, Coleman and his partner, Detective Bill Joyner, were no closer to finding Latasha. The case was featured. People watched. People talked about it. And still nothing. 1 year after her disappearance, the family held a vigil to mark the anniversary. Brenda Morgan spoke publicly, her voice heavy with exhaustion and grief. She said simply that it had been hard, that not knowing where her daughter was, not knowing what had happened, was one of the most painful things she had ever endured. And Latasha's daughter, Ariel, who was only about 11 by then, said something that stayed with people who heard it. She said she just wanted to see her mother, that she missed her a lot. The case remained open. The police continued to receive occasional tips, but the trail, for all intents and purposes, had gone cold, and for nearly 2.5 years, Latasha Nevitt remained missing. It was March 5th, 2014, a Wednesday morning, a kind of gray, unremarkable morning that passes without anyone paying much attention to it. A crew from the Chicago Water Department had been sent out to the area around the 10,700 block of South Loomis Street. Their assignment was routine. They needed to shut off a valve to work on a nearby water main. It was the kind of job that water workers do regularly, mundane, unremarkable. But when they arrived at the site and began their work, something stopped them. One of the workers discovered something inside a drain pipe, a valve basin built into the ground, the kind of infrastructure that runs beneath streets in cities like Chicago. It was a brick enclosure tucked into the earth, meant to house underground plumbing. Inside that basin there was a body. The worker, shaken, alerted the others. Word spread quickly. Police were called. By approximately 10:45 in the morning, officers had arrived on the scene. The Cook County Medical Examiner's office was notified. A coroner pronounced the woman dead on the scene at 12:45. That afternoon, the body was wrapped in a heavy-duty plastic bag. It appeared to have been stuffed, deliberately, forcefully, into the narrow space. It had not simply been placed there. Someone had taken the time to conceal it, and here is the detail that made this discovery particularly haunting. The drain pipe where the body was found was located on South Loomis Street, less than 100 feet from the home where Latasha Nevitt had lived with her husband and 3 children. Less than 100 feet. Some accounts place the distance at closer to 160 feet. But either way, the body had been found extraordinarily close to the Nevitt family home, close enough that on any given day someone walking out of that house might pass within a short distance of the spot where it lay hidden beneath the ground. For the next 24 hours, speculation consumed the neighborhood. People in Morgan Park had not forgotten Latasha Nevitt. Her disappearance had affected the community deeply, and now a woman's body, had been uncovered just steps from where she had once lived. The question on everyone's mind was the same. Could it be her? Isaac Nevitt himself was aware of what was happening. He lived only a few yards from where the discovery had been made. He had seen the city workers outside that morning. He had heard them, heard the commotion, heard the urgency in their voices. He went outside to find out what was going on, and the workers told him what they had found. He spoke to reporters later that day. Standing on his front porch, his words were measured. Careful. He said he was hoping it was not her, that if it wasn't, he was still praying for the family of whoever it might be. He said he had been waiting for 2.5 years already, waiting for answers, waiting for any resolution at all, and that he would wait another 2.5 years if he had to, as long as it wasn't Latasha. An autopsy was performed on the body the following day, a Friday, but the initial results were inconclusive. The decomposition was significant. The body had been in that pipe for a very long time. Dental records and other identification methods would be needed to make a positive identification. And then later that same day, Friday, March 7th, the Cook County Medical Examiner's office made the confirmation. The body was Latasha Nevitt. She was 32 years old at the time of her death. The details released by the Cook County Medical Examiner's office painted a picture that was deeply disturbing, not just because of what had been done to Latasha, but because of how carefully it had been done. Her body had been found frozen, curled into the fetal position. She had been wrapped tightly in garbage bags, heavy-duty plastic, and then stuffed into the narrow valve basin inside the drain pipe. The positioning of the body suggested that someone had taken care and effort to fit her into that small space. But that was not all. A scarf had been wrapped around her eyes, tied like a blindfold, and her legs had been bound together using a cell phone charging cord. These details, the blindfold, the binding, the careful concealment, suggested something methodical, something deliberate. This was not a crime of pure impulse. Someone had taken the time to secure Latasha, to cover her, and to hide her in a location that under normal circumstances might never have been discovered. As for the cause of death itself, the medical examiner could not determine it with certainty. The autopsy was classified as inconclusive on cause of death. The decomposition had simply progressed too far to allow the examiners to pinpoint exactly how Latasha had died. And so the official classification became this: homicide by unspecified means. She had been murdered. That much was certain, but the exact method how someone had taken her life remained unknown. In the days and weeks that followed the discovery, the air around the case became thick with suspicion and grief in equal measure. A memorial was held on Saturday, March 15th, just over a week after the body was identified. It took place at the intersection of 107th and Loomis, the very spot where Latasha's body had been found. Dozens of loved ones gathered. Latasha's 13-year-old daughter lit a candle. Her twin sons, now 4 years old, stood beside their father. Latasha's mother and aunt made passionate, emotional pleas for anyone with information to come forward and speak to the police. The community activist Andrew Holmes led the family in prayer. Balloons were released into the sky in Latasha's memory, a gesture the family described as a farewell, a sending off, a return to paradise. But there was tension at that memorial. Quiet, uncomfortable tension. Isaac Nevitt was present, and some members of the family, some of Latasha's closest loved ones, did not believe he belonged there. There were people in that crowd who believed, with varying degrees of conviction, that Isaac had something to do with what had happened to Latasha. The proximity of the body to their shared home, the 4-day delay in reporting her missing, the fact that he had been the last known person to see her alive. Isaac, for his part, maintained his innocence firmly and consistently. He said that 90% of the people around him believed he was guilty, that they looked at him with suspicion every single day. He acknowledged the weight of that. He said it was hard, but he also said something that revealed the depth of his own pain, or at least his claim to it. He said he had never understood what could have happened on that October night. He said he had stayed in the same house, the house where he and Latasha had lived together, and that he had made multiple missing person posters over the years, each one featuring a different hairstyle, in case Latasha had changed her appearance. And he said that if Latasha was somehow still alive somewhere out there in the world, he wanted her to know she could always come home, no matter what. Whether those words reflect the grief of an innocent man or the performance of a guilty one is something that no one, not the police, not the family, and not the public, has ever been able to definitively answer. The Chicago Police Department continued to investigate the case after the body was identified. Isaac Nevitt was interviewed. He was not, however, publicly named as a suspect, not at that time and not since. The police have never publicly announced anyone as a suspect in Latasha's murder, and that is where the case has remained. For years now, no arrests have been made. No one has been charged. No one has come forward. The case sits in a kind of suspended stillness, open technically but without movement, without resolution, without justice. In the years since, the family has continued to honor Latasha's memory. In March of 2026 years after her body was found, the family gathered once more at the corner of 107th and Loomis. They released balloons again. They stood together in the cold, and one mourner, voice steady, words deliberate, spoke directly to whoever was responsible. They said, "You know who you are, and you know what you did. It's time to come clean." Those words have hung in the air ever since, unanswered. There are many things about this case that people have turned over in their minds. Questions that don't have clean answers. Questions that keep the case alive in the public consciousness even after years of silence from investigators. Why did Isaac wait 4 days before reporting Latasha missing? Was it concern? Was it denial? Or was it something else entirely, something designed to create distance between the disappearance and the moment authorities became involved? Why was the body found so close to the home? Less than 100 feet. If someone wanted to hide a body and never have it found, why not take it somewhere far away? Somewhere remote. Somewhere that would never be checked. The proximity to the house could suggest panic. It could suggest convenience. Or it could suggest that whoever placed the body there simply did not believe it would ever be discovered inside a sealed infrastructure pipe beneath a quiet residential street. And what about the details of how the body was found? The blindfold, the binding, the careful wrapping. These details point toward a crime that was planned at least partially. They suggest that whoever killed Latasha took steps, however imperfect, to ensure that her body would not be easily identified or connected to anyone. There are also those who have raised questions about other possibilities entirely. Some have wondered whether Latasha's disappearance might have involved someone beyond her immediate household, whether there were conflicts or complications in her life that have not been made fully public, whether the investigation explored every avenue it should have. The show The First 48 captured only a small window of the early investigation, 48 hours, as the title suggests. Much of what happened after that, much of what was said in interviews, and much of what the detectives uncovered or failed to uncover, has never been made public in full. And so, the story remains, as it has for over a decade now, incomplete. Latasha Nevitt was a mother. She was a student. She was someone who by every account was working hard to build a better life for herself and her children. She walked out her front door on an October evening to go to the store, and she never came back. Her body was found less than 100 feet from that door, nearly 2.5 years later, and to this day no one has been held accountable for what was done to her. That's the story of Latasha Nevitt. It's a heavy one. I know that. And I'm sorry if it stirred something in you, if it made you feel uneasy or sad, or unsettled in the way that these stories sometimes do. But I want you to know something before you drift off. You are safe. Right now in this moment, you are exactly where you're supposed to be. The world is quiet. The night is still. Latasha's story is one that deserves to be remembered. Not for the horror of what happened to her, but for the life she lived. And for the family that has never stopped searching for the truth. If you ever come across information that might help bring her case to resolution, the Chicago Police Department is still accepting tips. But for now, for this moment, let it go, let the story settle. Let your breathing slow down. You listened. You heard her story. And that matters. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight I want to take you back to a place called Spring, Texas, a quiet suburb just outside of Houston. A place of long stretches of green lawns and ordinary afternoons. A place where on the surface, nothing unusual ever seemed to happen, but beneath that calm, something dark was already moving. This is the story of a girl named Kristen Galvin, and this is the story of what happened to her. Kristen Marie Galvin was born on the 23rd of April, in the year 2004. She grew up in the Spring area of Texas, a community that sits on the northern edge of the greater Houston metro, close enough to the city to feel its pulse, but far enough away to feel like a place where children could grow up without fear. By all accounts, Kristen was one of those kids who made a room feel brighter just by being in it. She was an honor roll student. She kept her grades up. She participated in her school's Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps, the Junior ROTC, and she was also a member of the drill team. She had been a Girl Scout. She was the kind of teenager her teachers liked to point to when someone asked what a good student looked like. Her family called her Kiki. Her mother, a woman named Robin Corey, has spoken about her daughter in interviews over the years. And the picture she paints is one of a child who was full of life. Kristen laughed easily. She played pranks on the people she loved. She was curious about the world in the way that teenagers sometimes are. Eager, open, and trusting. And that trust, as we will come to understand, is something that would eventually be turned against her. Kristen had blonde hair, hazel eyes, and a small heart-shaped tattoo on her ankle. She stood 5 feet and 6 inches tall. She was 15 years old when the story of her life took a turn. So dark that even now, years later, the full shape of what happened to her is still not entirely known. Before we go any further, There is a place you need to understand. A stretch of road in Houston that carries a reputation so heavy, so well documented, that its name alone tells you everything you need to know about the kind of suffering that can happen in plain sight. It is called Bissonnette Street, or more specifically, a section of it known simply as the Track. The Track is a corridor of road on Houston's southwest side, a loop of streets framed by Bissonnette, the Southwest Freeway, and Beltway 8. On the surface, it looks like any other stretch of urban road. There are restaurants, small businesses, apartment complexes. Families live there. Children walk to school there. But for decades, the Track has earned an international reputation as one of the most active open-air sex trafficking areas in the entire United States. Women and girls, some of them as young as 12 or 13, have been forced to walk these streets at night. Pimps circle the block in cars, watching their victims, controlling them through threats, through drugs, and through violence. John's men who pay for sex idle along the curb, making transactions in the open, in parking lots in the back seats of cars. It is a place where the most vulnerable people imaginable are treated as products. Houston, as a whole, has one of the highest rates of human trafficking in the country. Its geography plays a role. The city sits close to the Mexican border. It has major highways that run through it, like veins. And it has a sprawling, diverse population that makes it easy for traffickers to move victims without drawing attention. But the Track Bissonnette, that is where so much of it happens in the open, where the crime is so brazen, so normalized that residents have watched it from their kitchen windows for years. It is into this world that Kristen Galvin was pulled. In the fall of 2019, Kristen began talking to a young man online. His name was Ariane Dupree Jackson. He was a few years older than her. He called himself a rapper. His stage name was Young Corleone. On the outside, he presented himself as charming. He was the kind of person who could make a young girl feel seen, feel special, feel like she mattered. He told her the things that teenagers want to hear, that she was beautiful, that he understood her, that he cared about her in a way no one else did. Kristen began to think of him as her boyfriend. What she did not know, what no 15-year-old girl could have known, was that Orion Jackson was not a romantic interest. He was a predator, a documented gang member, a pimp who had been operating on and around the Track for some time, and who had a very specific way of recruiting his victims. It always started online. It always started with kindness. And it always ended the same way. And Jackson kept up to 12 girls and women in a house in northeast Houston, and he forced them to work the streets of Bissonnette. The victims were ordered to earn $1,000 a day. Each sex act paid anywhere from $100 to $300, which meant that in a single night, a girl could be forced to sleep with 3, 4, 5, or even more men just to meet his quota. The youngest girl in Jackson's operation was 14 years old. He controlled his victims through a combination of drugs, threats, and physical beatings. He threatened to kill or harm the families of anyone who tried to leave. He pointed a handgun at one woman's head and told her he would shoot her if she did not comply. He even required his victims to get tattoos, a 5-point crown and a bag of money branded onto their bodies like a mark of ownership. He had Instagram accounts where he posted photographs of himself holding guns and stacks of cash. He openly discussed being a pimp. He wore his cruelty like a badge, and Kristen, who was only 15, walked straight into his world without ever understanding what it was. In the late autumn of 2019, Kristen left home with Jackson. She told no one where she was going. To her family, she simply vanished. For a week and a half, no one knew where she was. During that time, Kristen was inside Jackson's house on Bissonnette Street. She was being trafficked. She was being forced to have sex with strangers for money. She was a child, a 15-year-old child, and she was being treated as a commodity. Then, after roughly 10 days, Houston police located her. They pulled her out of that house and brought her back to her family in spring. Kristen was home. She was alive. And on the surface, the nightmare was over. But it was not over. Not even close. When Kristen returned to her parents, she was not the same girl who had left. The trauma of what she had endured had cut deeply into her. She told her mother about the threats that had been made. Not just against her, but against the entire family. Jackson and his associates had told her that if she ever tried to escape, they would come after the people she loved. Kristen was terrified, and she was broken in ways that a 15-year-old should never have to be broken. Her parents wanted to get her the help she needed. They looked into residential treatment programs, specialized facilities designed to help young people recover from the trauma of sex trafficking. But these programs are expensive. They are not easily accessible, and Robin Corey, Kristen's mother, could not afford them. So instead, Kristen was enrolled in therapy. She saw a psychiatrist. Her parents did everything they could within their means to help her heal. Slowly, cautiously, life began to return to something resembling normal. And then in early January of 2020, as part of her recovery, Kristen was given back her cell phone. It was a small thing, a sign of trust, a sign that the family believed she was getting better. She got her phone back on the 1st of January. The very next day, she was gone. January 2nd, 2020. Kristen was staying at her grandmother's home in Spring, Texas during the winter holiday break. It was supposed to be a quiet time, a restful time, a time for family. At some point during that night or very early that morning, Kristen left. She walked out of her grandmother's house and she did not come back. When Robin Corey woke up and realized her daughter was missing, the world as she knew it cracked open. This was not the first time Kristen had disappeared, but it was different now. The first time there had been a trail to follow. Jackson Bissonnette Street, a house where she had been held. The police had found her. But this time there was nothing. No message. No phone call. No trail at all. Kristen had simply vanished into the dark. In the days and weeks that followed, Robin Corey did what any mother would do. She called the police. She filed reports. She waited for answers. But answers did not come. The pandemic was beginning to grip the country. COVID-19 was spreading, and the world was shutting down in ways no one had anticipated. Law enforcement resources were stretched thin. Media attention was difficult to secure, and for Robin it felt as though the systems that were supposed to protect her herder had simply looked away, so she decided to take matters into her own hands. Robin hired a private investigator. She began driving along Bissonnette Street herself, sometimes on weekends, sometimes at night, searching the faces of the women and girls she saw walking the streets. Hoping desperately that one of them might be Kristen, she rented cars, she borrowed vehicles, she wore wigs and disguises to avoid being recognized, because she had begun to suspect that someone was watching her. At one point, she noticed that her own vehicle was being followed by unknown individuals. She was a mother searching for her child in the darkest corners of a city, and no one was going to stop her. In June of 2020, Robin connected with the Texas Center for the Missing and with a billboard company called Clear Channel. Together, they began putting up billboards across the Houston area bearing Kristen's face and the words, "Where is Kristen?" The billboards brought attention. They brought tips. But for a long time, they did not bring answers. By the spring of 2021, authorities publicly stated what Robin had long suspected, that Kristen was likely a victim of sex trafficking a second time. And then a lead emerged. People began reporting that they had seen a photograph of Kristen on a website known for advertising sexual services. The image appeared in an advertisement in the Atlanta, Georgia area, listed alongside several other young women. When the Houston District Attorney's Office contacted Robin and showed her two photographs, one showing a partially covered face, another showing strands of hair, she recognized her daughter immediately. Robin flew to Atlanta. She found the website. She located some of the other girls who had been listed in the same advertisement. She spoke to them. She searched the streets. She did everything she could think of to find Kristen. But Kristen was not there. The other girls denied knowing where she was. The trail which had seemed so promising went cold. Robin came home without her daughter. Meanwhile, the man who had first pulled Kristen into this nightmare was facing consequences, though not for what had been done to Kristen specifically. Arian Jackson had been arrested back in November of 2019, initially on weapons and drug possession charges. Once he was in custody, investigators discovered he was also wanted in connection with sex trafficking charges. But even while sitting in a jail cell, even while awaiting trial, Jackson did not stop. He smuggled cell phones and drugs into the Harris County Jail. He continued to make phone calls to his victims. He continued to control them from behind bars. On December 19th, 2022, Jackson pleaded guilty to sex trafficking of a minor and conspiracy to traffic an adult female by force, fraud, or coercion. On February 14th, 2023, he was sentenced. The judge, U.S. District Judge Lee Rosenthal, called his crimes horrific. She said she struggled over what the right sentence should be. She sentenced Ariane Dupree Jackson to 27 years in federal prison. During the sentencing, Jackson cried. He told the judge that he had never had a fair chance in life. He pointed to his upbringing. His mother had been in the sex trade and was addicted to drugs. His father had served time in prison as well. Jackson asked for mercy. The judge did not grant it. 27 years. He would also have to register as a sex offender upon release, and serve 15 years of supervised release after that. Jackson's mother, a woman named Tashieka Bush, was also charged with sex trafficking. She pleaded guilty and awaited her own sentencing. But through all of this, through the trial, through the guilty plea, through the sentencing, Jackson claimed he did not know where Kristen Galvin was. He denied even knowing her. And so, as one chapter closed, another remained wide open. In the years that followed Kristen's disappearance, several other threads were pulled, and each one led to darkness. A private investigator working the case was contacted by a woman named Latasha, who claimed she had been held against her will and trafficked out of a house in Atlanta. The same house, she said, where Kristen had been held. Latasha provided testimony. She shared what she knew, but when the private investigator later tried to reach Latasha again, she learned that Latasha had passed away. A friend on Latasha's social media said she had been murdered. Latasha's own mother said she had died of an aneurysm. The truth of what happened to Latasha was never made entirely clear. There were other strange threads too. At one point, someone contacted the private investigator claiming to be Kristen herself. The messages were unsettling, and ultimately they appeared to be a deception. Someone was pretending to be a missing 15-year-old girl. Who did that and why remains unknown. In June of 2021, a deceased infant was found in a portable restroom in Houston. Someone had suggested a connection to Kristen, and a DNA test was requested. Months later, the investigator received a message saying the DNA was not a match, but no documentation was ever provided to confirm this. Every lead seemed to twist into something darker, something more confusing, something that raised more questions than it answered. And through it all, Robin Corey kept searching. In the midst of all of this grief and uncertainty, Robin Corey did not stop fighting. Not just for Kristen, but for every child caught in the web of human trafficking. She became an advocate. She spoke to the press. She attended court proceedings, though she said she was repeatedly denied the chance to present her daughter's crime impact statement or to seek restitution from those who had been convicted. She felt deeply and painfully that the justice system had failed not only her daughter but an entire community of vulnerable children. But her voice was heard. In the spring of 2024, Houston city officials honored Robin at City Hall. Mayor John Whitmire and Councilmember Mary Nan Huffman presented her with a proclamation. They declared April 23rd Kristen's birthday as Kiki's Day, a day to honor her memory and to raise awareness about the horrors of child sex trafficking. It was a small gesture in the face of an enormous wound, but it was something. It was the city acknowledging that Kristen mattered, that her story mattered. Robin accepted the proclamation and told the room, "She'll be forever 15 in our hearts until she's home." And now we come to the part of this story that changes everything. The part that, for years, no one knew. On January 29th, 2020, less than 4 weeks after Kristen disappeared, a set of female human remains was discovered in Missouri City, Texas. Missouri City is a suburb that sits just southwest of Houston, not far from the areas where Kristen had last been seen. Investigators examined the remains. They were unable to make an identification. The body was given a case number and labeled as an unidentified female, a Jane Doe, and placed into a database called NAMUS, which is a national system used to track missing and unidentified persons. And there the remains stayed, unidentified, unconnected to anyone, a mystery filed away while the world continued to move on. 2 years later, in 2022, Robin Corey came across the Jane Doe's profile on NAMUS while she was searching desperately for any information that might lead her to Kristen. Something about the profile caught her attention. She asked law enforcement to run a DNA test to compare the remains to Kristen's DNA. The officers working the case told her they did not believe the remains belonged to Kristen. They declined to test the DNA at that time. Robin was told to keep looking, and so she did. For 3 more years, she kept looking. In July of 2025, Robin Corey finally provided a DNA sample of her own to be compared against the unidentified remains that had been sitting in a file for over 5 years. The following month, in August of 2025, she received the results. The DNA was a match. The remains found in Missouri City, Texas, on January 29th, 2020, just 27 days after Kristen vanished, belonged to Kristen Marie Galvin. Kristen had not been trafficked to Atlanta. She had not been seen on escort websites in another state. She had not been held against her will somewhere far away, waiting to be found. She had been dead for over 5 years. She had been dead almost from the very beginning. After the identification was confirmed, investigators revealed what they believed had happened to her. They believed that Kristen was bound with duct tape, and then she was stabbed to death. She was 15 years old. The confirmation of Kristen's death raised a wave of questions. Questions that, as of this moment, have not been answered. Who killed her? The killer, or killers, have not been identified. No arrests have been made in connection with Kristen's murder. The case remains open and active, but the person responsible for ending the life of a 15-year-old girl has not yet been brought to justice. Why did it take so long? Kristen's remains were found in January of 2020. Her mother asked for a DNA test in 2022. Law enforcement declined. It was not until 2025 that the test was finally done. 5.5 years passed between the discovery of those remains and the moment Robin learned the truth about her daughter, who was impersonating Kristen. In 2021, someone contacted the private investigator working the case and claimed to be Kristen herself. Now that we know Kristen had been dead for over a year at that point, the question becomes unavoidable. Who was sending those messages and why? Was it someone trying to throw investigators off the trail? Someone who knew what had happened and wanted to keep it buried? These are not questions with easy answers. They are the kind of questions that sit in the dark unanswered, and that keep a case like this alive long after the world has moved on. Through all of it, through the searching, the billboards, the trips to Atlanta, the nights spent driving along Bissonnette Street in disguise, the court appearances, the advocacy, the grief, Robin Corey never stopped. She helped rescue and reunite several other missing girls with their families during her search for Kristen. She watched those girls return to safety, to their mothers, to their lives. She celebrated those moments even as her own wound stayed open. She said in one interview that the thought had crossed her mind that Kristen might be dead. She said, "What hasn't crossed my mind? My daughter is being raped, sold. How much worse can it get? I promised her I wouldn't let anything more happen to her. So I'm keeping my promise." And even after the DNA results came back, even after the worst possible truth was confirmed, Robin Corey has not stopped advocating. She has not stopped speaking. She has not stopped fighting for the children who are still out there, right now trapped in the same system that swallowed her daughter. Because Kristen's story is not just one story. It is thousands of stories. It is happening in Houston. It is happening across Texas. It is happening in cities and suburbs and quiet neighborhoods, all over this country, in places where no one would think to look. Kristen Marie Galvin, born on the 23rd of April, 2004, a girl who loved to laugh, a girl who played pranks on the people she loved, a Girl Scout, an honor roll student, a child who deserved so much more than the world gave her. She was 15 years old, and now, tonight as the hours of the night stretch out ahead of you, I want you to hold her name gently in your mind, not with fear, not with dread, sort with compassion, with the quiet acknowledgement that she was here, that she mattered, that her story, no matter how heavy, is a story worth knowing. The case of Kristen Galvin is still open. Her killer has not been found, and somewhere out there answers still exist, waiting to be uncovered, waiting to bring a family a measure of peace. If you or someone you know has any information related to this case, you can reach out to the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office or to the FBI Houston Field Office. You can also contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children or the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Every piece of information matters. Every single one. But for now, for this moment, let the weight of this story settle. You have listened. You have honored her by listening, and now it is time to rest. If you're still awake and listening, Check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, I'm going to take you somewhere, not far, just deep enough into a story that your thoughts will have somewhere to go, somewhere other than the noise of the world outside. So, breathe in, and let me tell you about a young woman from Philadelphia, a young woman named Nija. Her name was Nija Nevaeh Council, and in the summer of 2013, she simply vanished. To understand what happened in Nija Council, you first have to understand who she was. Not just a name in a database. Not just a photograph attached to a missing persons report. She was a real person. A mother. A daughter. Someone who had people around her who cared about her. People who, even years later, still haven't stopped looking. Nija Nevaeh Council was born on the 23rd of July, 1993, right there in the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She grew up in Philly. She went to school in Philly. Philadelphia was the only world she had ever known, and it was the same city that would one day swallow her whole. By the time she was 20 years old, Nija had already become a mother, twice. She had 2 sons. One of them was still very young, still in that soft early stage of life, where a mother's presence is everything. An infant. And Nija loved her boys, the people who knew her, her friends, the people who moved through her daily life. They would tell you the same thing. She was young. Yes, she was navigating the kind of life that 20-year-olds navigate. But she was there. She was present. She was trying. Nija had also found her way into a professional life that, for someone her age, showed real ambition. She was working as what is called an alternative dispute resolution professional. It's a mouthful, I know. But what it means is that she was involved in helping people resolve conflicts, often outside of a courtroom. It's the kind of work that requires patience, that requires you to listen to people, to understand both sides of something difficult. For a young woman of 20, that's not a small thing. She had a presence online too, like so many people her age. Nija kept up with social media. She had a Facebook page. She posted. She interacted. She was connected to the world around her in the way that young people in 2013 connected through screens. Through likes, through the small digital breadcrumbs that we all leave behind without ever thinking about it. And those breadcrumbs, as we'll come to see, would become some of the most unsettling pieces of this puzzle. But before we get to that, let's talk about where Nija lived, because the place matters. Nija was living on Lindbergh Boulevard in Philadelphia. Specifically, her residence was at a house in the 6200 block of that street. Now, Philadelphia is a city of neighborhoods. Each one has its own character, its own rhythm, its own feel. Lindbergh Boulevard is a stretch of road that on the surface looks like any other residential street in a big American city. Houses close together, sidewalk, the kind of neighborhood where people know their neighbors, or at least they used to. It was here, on this street and in this house, that Nija was living with her sons. It was here that she went about her daily life. It was here that she was last seen, and it was here that the trail goes cold. Now, in the weeks leading up to what would become the disappearance of Nija Council, there's one small detail that has surfaced in the accounts of those searching for her, and it's the kind of detail that on its own means almost nothing. But when you look at it in the context of what comes next, it lingers. About a month before she disappeared, Nija had been having trouble with her car trouble. That's it. That's the detail. It sounds ordinary. It sounds like something that happens to everyone at some point, something you call your mechanic about, something you grumble about on a Tuesday morning when you're already running late. But think about what car trouble means for someone in Nija's position. She was a 20-year-old mother of 2. She was working, she depended on that car. Without it, her world got smaller. Getting to work became harder. Getting her children where they needed to go became harder. Everything became just a little bit more difficult, a little bit more dependent on other people, a little bit more constrained. We don't know exactly what the issue was. We don't know if it was fixed before she disappeared, or if it wasn't. But it's there, sitting in the background of this story, and it's the kind of thing that quietly reshapes a person's daily routine in ways that outsiders might never notice. The 1st of September, 2013. That is the date that the Philadelphia Police Department lists as the date Nija Council was last seen. It is the date that appears on official records. It is the date that the Charlie Project, one of the most well-known missing persons databases in this country, is attached to her name. On that day, according to what has been reported, Nija left her home on Lindbergh Boulevard. Her boyfriend was the last person to see her. She left without her infant son, and she never came back. Now, I want to sit with that for a moment because there's a lot packed into those few sentences, and I don't want to rush past it. She left the house, that means she made a choice, or at least it appears that way. She wasn't dragged out. She wasn't taken in the middle of the night while everyone slept. She walked out, without her baby. And that is the part that makes this story so difficult to tell. Because on one hand, it could mean that something pulled her away from that house. Something urgent, something unexpected, something we can't see from the outside. On the other hand, people who knew her, people who loved her, have spent over a decade struggling with the question of why. Why would she leave without him? The answer to that question, if there is one, has never been made public. Here is where the story takes a turn that no one quite expected. You see, the official date of disappearance is September 1st. That's what law enforcement recorded. That's what went into the system. But when researchers and bloggers began digging into Nija's digital footprints, her Facebook page, her posts, her activity, they found something that didn't quite fit. Nija had activity on her Facebook page after September 1st. On September 11th, 10 days after she was supposedly last seen, she made 4 posts on her Facebook account. Later in the month, she changed her profile picture. She did it more than once. The last time she updated her profile picture was on September 23rd. Now, people began to notice. Friends. People who cared about her. The comments that appeared beneath one of her profile picture changes. The one on September 16th showed that people were already worried. They were already asking questions. They were already reaching out, trying to figure out where she was. What was going on? And this is where the case becomes genuinely confusing. Not just sad, but strange. Because if Nija was posting on Facebook after September 1st, then what does September 1st actually mean? Was it the date she was last physically seen by someone in person? Was it simply an approximation, a way of saying she disappeared sometime during the month of September? Or was there something else going on entirely? The researcher who runs the Charlie Project blog, a woman named Mayan, who has spent years documenting missing persons cases across the country. She wrote about this openly. She said she felt the official case file was, and I'm paraphrasing here, incomplete at best, and probably misleading. She couldn't reconcile what the police records said with what the social media evidence showed. And that tension, that gap, between what the records say and what the digital evidence suggests, is one of the things that makes Nija's case so haunting. Because it means we don't even have a firm grip on when exactly she stopped being reachable. The timeline itself is uncertain, and in a disappearance, the timeline is everything. So somewhere between the 1st of September and the 23rd of September, 2013, in that narrow window of days, Nija Council drifted out of contact with the world. Slowly or all at once, we don't know. But by the end of that month, she was gone. One of the things that makes disappearance cases like this one so difficult is that they often fall through the cracks. Not because nobody cares, but because the systems that are supposed to catch people, supposed to notice when someone vanishes, don't always work the way they should, especially when the person who disappears is young. When they're a woman, when they come from a community that has historically been underrepresented in the media coverage of missing persons cases. Nijizania's case received very little attention from mainstream news outlets. There were no headlines, no press conferences, no viral social media campaigns. At least, none that reached the kind of scale that some other missing persons cases have reached in recent years. But that doesn't mean no one was looking. The Dodge's friends, the people in her life who knew her, who cared about her, they took it upon themselves to search. They created a Facebook group dedicated to finding her. They shared her information. They kept her name alive in the way that communities do when the larger systems fail them. Quietly, persistently, with the kind of stubborn love that doesn't make the news but never really stops. The case was eventually picked up by organizations like the Charlie Project and Underground Mysteries, groups that specifically focus on missing persons who have been overlooked or underreported. These are the people who compile the details, create the case files, and try to make sure that every missing person, no matter how little attention they received, at least has their story told. Detective Davis, with the Philadelphia Police Department, was assigned to Najaji's case. The contact number for the department in connection with this case has been made public, and it remains active to this day, which means, technically, the case is still open, still unsolved, still waiting. Let me lay out as gently as I can what we actually know about this case, and what we don't. What we know is this. Nija Navea Council was a 20-year-old mother living in Philadelphia. She had 2 sons. She was working. She was engaged with her life, with her community, with her social media, with the people around her. She was having trouble with her car in the weeks before she disappeared. Her boyfriend was the last person to see her in person. She left her home on or around the 1st of September, 2013. She did not take her infant son with her. She had activity on her Facebook page for at least several weeks after that date. At some point during September, she stopped posting. She stopped being heard from, and she has not been seen or heard from since. What we don't know is almost everything else. We don't know where she went that day. She left the house. We don't know if she was meeting someone. We don't know if she was in distress. We don't know if the car trouble played a role. If she needed a ride somewhere. If she got into someone else's vehicle. We don't know if her phone was active, or if police were ever able to ping it and trace its location. We don't know what her Facebook posts on September 11th actually said. We don't know what prompted the worry in the comments of her September 16th profile picture change. We don't know if she was struggling with something that her loved ones didn't fully unsend. And we don't know, we truly honestly do not know whether Nija Council is alive somewhere right now, living under a different name, in a different city, cut off from the world she once knew, or whether something happened to her, something dark, something that ended her story before it had a chance to finish. That uncertainty is one of the cruelest parts of a case like this. For the people who loved her, for her sons, for her family, for her friends who made that Facebook group and kept sharing her photo year after year. The not knowing is its own kind of suffering. It never closed, it just hangs there, open like a door that was left ajar a long time ago, and no one has ever come back through it. Nija's case is not unique in the way it unfolded. Across this country, there are thousands of missing persons cases that received little to no media attention. Many of them involve young women. Many of them involve communities where historically the disappearance of a person did not generate the same level of public urgency that other cases did. Philadelphia itself has seen its share of these stories. The city is large. It is complex. And within its boundaries, lives disappear in ways that the rest of the country never hears about. Organizations like NMIS, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, maintain databases that include cases like Nija's. The Charlie Project, run by volunteers and researchers, works to bring light to cases that might otherwise stay buried. Underground Mysteries does the same. These are the people who keep the names alive, who make sure that even when the world moves on, the question hasn't been forgotten. And there is something important about that, something worth sitting with. Even as you drift toward sleep tonight, the idea that somewhere, out there, someone is still holding the door open, still hoping, still asking the question. I think about Nija sometimes. After I've spent time with her story, I think about what it must have been like. That morning, or that afternoon, whenever it was, the last time she walked through the door of that house on Lindbergh Boulevard. Did she know? Could anyone ever know in a moment like that it was the last time? She was 20 years old. She had 2 sons. She had a job that required her to help other people work through difficult things. She had a life that was still being built, still being shaped, still becoming whatever it was going to become. And then quietly, without the kind of dramatic moment that stories usually have, without a scream, without a headline, without the world stopping to notice, she was gone. That's what makes this kind of story so difficult to shake. It's not the violence of it. We don't even know if there was violence. It's the quietness, the ordinariness of the day it happened on. The way the world just kept turning, and most people never knew that a piece of it had gone missing. If you have any information, any at all, about the disappearance of Nija Navia Council, the Philadelphia Police Department is still accepting tips. Detective Davis was assigned to her case, and the department's number remains active. Her friends and family are still searching. The door is still open. And if you're listening to this tonight, if this story has settled over you the way these stories sometimes do, I want you to know something. You listened. You spent time with Nijia's story. You held space for someone whose name most of the world has never heard. And that matters. More than you might think. That matters. So now, let the story settle. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight, I am going to tell you a story, one that unfolded quietly, in a place most people have never heard of, in the wide open stillness of Kansas, beside a lake where the water sits calm and the tall grasses sway without sound. It is a story about a woman named Anna, a woman who for a long time was unknown to the world. A woman whose life and whose death raise questions that no one has yet been able to answer, so let yourself settle in, let your breathing slow, and let me take you there. Anna Marie Baldwin was born on the 15th of August, 1977, in a small town called Onaga in northeastern Kansas. It was a quiet place, the kind of town where everyone knew your name and the days moved gently from one into the next. Her childhood was shaped by her grandparents. Harold and Norma Ellen Baldwin raised Anna as their own. They lived in a town called Holton, not far from where she was born, and Anna grew up under their care, surrounded by the kind of slow, rural Kansas life that is easy to forget exists, where the mornings are cool, the land stretches out flat and golden, and the world moves at a pace that invites stillness. She went to school at Holton High School, and she graduated in 1996. After that, she stayed close to what she knew. She moved to Topeka, the state capital, just a short drive away, and she found work in the restaurant industry. It was not glamorous work. It was the kind of work that keeps a person grounded, that fills the hours, that asks you to show up and do what needs to be done. Anna had 3 children, Yasmin, Juliet, and Frank. They carried the last name Cousteau. By the time Anna disappeared, they were scattered across the country. Yasmin was living in Maine. Juliet had settled in Nebraska, and Frank was all the way in New Hampshire. They were spread apart the way families sometimes are when life pulls people in different directions. She also had 2 brothers. Michael lived in a town called Hiawatha. Mark stayed closer to home, in Holton, and her father, Harold Baldwin Jr., remained in Holton as well. Her mother, Rhonda, lived in a nearby town called Hort. Anna was 40 years old, and she had, by all accounts, lived a quiet, unremarkable life, in a quiet, unremarkable part of the world. The kind of life that does not make headlines. The kind of life that moves through the years without drawing much attention at all. But there was one thing about Anna that her family mentioned to investigators later. Something small, but something that would become important. Anna was not someone who kept in regular touch. It was not unusual. Her family said, for weeks to pass without a word from her. Sometimes it was longer than that. A month. Sometimes even longer. There were stretches of silence that came and went, and no one thought much of it. It was simply the way Anna was. The way she moved through her life, sometimes present, sometimes gone, but always, eventually, returning. Or at least, that is what everyone believed. And there was one more thing about Anna that people who knew her remembered. She had a dog, a pit bull, black and white, and she kept that dog by her side. Wherever Anna went, the dog went with her. It was a constant, a companion, the one steady presence in her life. When Anna vanished, the dog vanished too. The last time anyone in Anna's family heard from her was sometime in late autumn of 2016. No one remembers the exact date. There was no final phone call that stood out, no conversation that anyone thought to hold on to. It was just another exchange, ordinary, unremarkable, and then after that, there was nothing. Silence. But here is the thing. The silence did not alarm anyone. Not at first. Not for a long time. Because Anna had gone quiet before. Weeks would pass, and no one would call to check. Months would drift by, and the family would wait, trusting that she would resurface when she was ready. And so, they waited. Winter came. The Kansas cold settled over the land, the way it does, heavy and still, turning the mornings gray and the nights long. And still, no word from Anna. Spring arrived. The frost began to thaw. The tall grasses of the Flint Hills started to stir back to life, and the world outside began to warm again. And still nothing. Summer came, and Anna Marie Baldwin was already dead. Melbourne Lake sits in Osage County, Kansas, about 45 minutes south of Topeka. It is a large man-made reservoir, nearly 7,000 acres of water, built in the 1970s by the United States Army Corps of Engineers to control the flooding of the Marais des Cygnes River. The land around it stretches out in rolling hills, covered with tall native grasses, and on calm days the water is so still it barely seems to move at all. It is the kind of place people come to fish, to camp, to sit quietly by the shore and let the hours pass. A peaceful place. A place where the sounds are birdsong and rustling grass, and sometimes the gentle lap of water against the bank. On the north side of the lake, there is an area called Turkey Point. It is a day-use recreation zone, a stretch of open ground near the water, where visitors come to picnic, to walk, to enjoy the outdoors, without staying overnight. During the summer months, it sees a steady stream of visitors. It was the evening of the 25th of August, 2017, when a park ranger with the Army Corps of Engineers was conducting a routine check of the Turkey Point area. It was around 5:30 in the afternoon. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, warm light across the land. And then the ranger saw something. Skeletal remains. Human skeletal remains, lying in the open ground near the water. The ranger immediately contacted the Osage County Sheriff's Office. By 20 minutes past 6 that evening, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, the KBI, had been called in to take over the case. When investigators arrived and began to examine what had been found, they quickly understood they were looking at something deeply troubling. The remains were badly decomposed. Whoever this person had been, they had been dead for some time, long enough for the elements and the passage of months to reduce a human life to bone. But there was one detail that told investigators this was not a natural death. This person had been shot. The remains were so deteriorated that the KBI could not immediately identify the victim. They did not yet know who this woman was. They did not know her name, her age, or where she had come from. They knew only that she was a woman, and that she had been killed. To try to learn more, the KBI turned to the experts at the Washburn University Anthropology Department, based in Topeka. Forensic specialists there worked carefully with the remains, applying their knowledge of the human body to extract whatever information they could from what was left behind. After their examination, they were able to determine several things. The victim was female. She was likely between the ages of 35 and 50, and based on the condition of the remains, she had most likely been killed sometime between April and July of 2017, though the experts noted it was possible she had died as far back as the late autumn of the previous year. Beyond that, the picture was frustratingly incomplete. Weeks passed. The KBI worked quietly, carefully, following whatever threads they could find. But there were few threads to follow. No one had reported a woman missing from the area. No one had come forward to say they recognized what had been found at Turkey Point. And so, in late September of 2017, about a month after the remains were discovered, the KBI made a public appeal. They released details about the clothing that had been found with the body, along with photographs of personal items recovered at the scene. Among them were 2 rings, a bracelet, and a pair of eyeglasses. They hoped that someone somewhere might recognize these things. that someone might look at the photographs and say, yes, I know who wore those. I know who she was. For a long time, no one did. Almost a year passed. The remains had been found in August of 2017. Through the autumn, through the winter, into the spring and summer of the following year, the KBI continued their work and the Washburn University team continued theirs, searching for any way to give this woman back her identity. And finally, on the 27th of July, 2018, nearly 11 months after the discovery, they had their answer. The woman was Anna Marie Baldwin. She was 40 years old. She had lived in Topeka, Kansas. It was a quiet confirmation, in many ways. No dramatic moment. No sudden breakthrough. Just the slow, careful work of science and investigation, arriving at a truth that had been waiting all along. But the identification brought with it a wave of new questions. Questions that even now remain unanswered. The first was simply this. When did Anna die? The forensic evidence suggested a window of time, somewhere between late autumn of 2016 and the summer of 2017. But it could not be narrowed down further. No one knew the exact date. No one knew the exact moment when Anna's life ended. The second question was about her disappearance. Anna had never been reported missing. Her family had not raised an alarm because silence from Anna was not unusual. But now that her remains had been found, investigators began to trace backward to try to understand where Anna had been in the months before her death, who she had been with, and what had led her to the shores of Malvern Lake. And the third question, the one that haunts the case still, was about her dog. The black and white pit bull that had always been by her side. The one companion that followed Anna wherever she went. When her remains were found at Turkey Point, the dog was not there, and no one has ever said what happened to it. It simply disappeared, along with Anna, into the silence. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation has continued to look into Anna's case, but as of the most recent updates, the investigation has not produced an arrest. No suspect has been publicly named. No motive has been identified. In the spring of 2022, the state of Kansas launched an unusual effort to bring attention to its unsolved cases. The Kansas Department of Corrections, working alongside the KBI and several law enforcement associations, created a deck of playing cards, each card bearing the details of a cold case. The cards were designed to be distributed inside the state's prisons and jails, in the hope that someone among the inmates might have information that could help solve one of these long-dormant cases. Anna Marie Baldwin was placed on the Six of Hearts. Her card carried the basic facts of the case: the discovery at Malvern Lake, the gunshot wound, the long stretch of time during which no one knew she was gone. A quiet summary of a life that ended without explanation, printed on a playing card and slipped into the hands of strangers behind prison walls. It is an unusual approach, but it reflects something real about the nature of cold cases. The understanding that the person who holds the key to solving them might be anyone. A stranger. Someone who heard something, saw something, or knows something they have never spoken aloud. The KBI has said publicly that they want to hear from anyone who had contact with Anna Marie Baldwin in late 2016, or at any point during 2017. They are hoping to retrace her movements to understand where she went, who she was with, and what brought her to that quiet stretch of lakeside ground where her remains were eventually found. As of now, those questions remain open. And so, that is where we leave Anna's story tonight. Not with an ending, not yet, but with an open door. A question still waiting for someone to walk through it and offer an answer. There are so many cases like this one. Stories that trail off into silence. Lives that ended without anyone noticing for a long, long time. And somewhere out there, someone knows something. A detail, a memory, a moment they have carried quietly for years. Something that might be the piece the investigation has been missing all along. But tonight, that is not yours to carry. If you or someone you know has information regarding the murder of Anna Marie Baldwin, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation is still accepting tips. You can reach them by calling 1-800-KS-CRIME or by submitting information online through the KBI website. Please, if you haven't drifted off yet, check in with me. Tell me which story has been the most chilling so far. The first, the second, or the third. And if you're enjoying these stories, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Now, let's move on to story number 5. Story 5. Tonight I want to tell you a story, not a loud one, not a frantic one, a quiet one. A story that unfolds slowly the way fog creeps across a city at night, gently, almost silently until you realize it has covered everything. This is a story about a woman named Sharetha Morrison, a mother, a daughter, a sister, a woman who on an ordinary Friday morning in the middle of winter simply vanished and left behind a silence that no one in her family has ever been able to fill. So breathe in, breathe out, and let me tell you what happened. Before we go any further, before we talk about what happened on that cold morning in February, I want you to know who Sharetha was. Because in cases like this, in stories like this, it is so easy to reduce a person to a set of facts, a date, a location, a case number. But Sharetha Morrison was not a case number. She was a real person, a living, breathing woman who woke up every morning and made choices and loved people deeply. Sharetha lived in the Englewood neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, Illinois. Englewood is one of the city's oldest and most historically significant neighborhoods. A place where generations of families have put down roots, raised children, and built lives, even through difficult times. It is a neighborhood that has seen its share of hardship, but it is also a neighborhood full of people who care about one another, people who look out for their own. Sharetha was 38 years old. She stood just under 5 feet tall, 4 feet 11 inches, and weighed about 140 pounds. She had black hair and brown eyes, and a medium brown complexion. She had a small piercing on the lower right side of her lip, and she had tattoos, the kind that tell you something about the people a woman carries with her wherever she goes. On her upper left arm, she had a large heart with the name Cheryl written inside it, and the words R.I.P. above it, a memorial to someone she loved and lost. On her left forearm, the name Glorious, her daughter's name, written there permanently, a declaration of devotion. A large red rose on her upper right arm, the name Rita on the side of her neck. These were not decorations. These were promises. These were the faces of the people who mattered most to her, inked into her skin so she would never ever forget them. And those people, the ones she loved, they mattered deeply. Sharetha had 2 children. Her son Jermaine was 20 years old at the time of her disappearance. A young man, but still very much her boy. And her daughter Glorious was just 5 years old, little Glorious, who was named with such tenderness that even strangers hearing it for the first time might pause and smile. Sharetha was also pregnant. She was carrying her 3rd child somewhere between 3.5 and 4 months along, depending on which account you read. That pregnancy was real. That baby was real. And both of them disappeared that February morning along with her. Her sister, Aretha Miller, was close to her. They talked often. They looked out for each other the way siblings do. Not always perfectly, not always without friction, but with a loyalty that runs deeper than anything words can capture. And Sharetha's niece, Robin Calhoun, was part of that fabric too. A young woman who would later stand before cameras and plead for answers, her voice breaking, her eyes full of a grief that had no end in sight. This is the woman we are talking about tonight. Not a headline, not a mystery to be solved for entertainment. A mother. A sister, a woman who loved her children so fiercely that the very idea of her abandoning them, of her choosing to walk away, was something her family could never ever believe. And as we will come to understand, the evidence would eventually agree with them. It was Friday, February 26th, 2021. Winter in Chicago is not gentle. It is a long, gray, biting season, the kind that makes people draw their coats tighter and move a little faster through the streets. Eager to get inside, eager to get warm. February is often the coldest month, and that particular February carried with it the particular heaviness that only a Chicago winter can bring. That morning, Sharetha Morrison woke up and got ready for her day. It was supposed to be a simple day, an ordinary day, the kind of day that most people do not remember afterward. Because nothing unusual happens. You wake up, you get dressed, you take care of your children, you go about your business, you come home. That morning, Sharetha had 2 things she needed to do. First, she needed to drop her daughter Glorious off at school. Glorious attended Earl Elementary School, located in the 2000 block of West 62nd Street, right there in the Englewood neighborhood, not far from where they lived. It was a routine trip, The kind of drive a parent makes dozens of times without thinking about it. Second, after dropping Glorious off, Sharetha was supposed to meet up with her son Jermaine. They had plans to see each other that morning. Nothing dramatic, just a mother and her adult son, spending a little time together. It was the kind of small, ordinary connection that keeps a family stitched together. A cup of coffee, a quick visit, a chance to check in on one another. So that morning, Sharetha got into her car, a silver Porsche Cayenne, a large silver SUV that stood out on the streets of Englewood. She drove to Earl Elementary. She dropped Glorious off at the school. And then she drove away. And that was the last time anyone who knew her saw Sharetha Morrison alive. For a while that morning, nothing seemed wrong. Sharetha had dropped her daughter off. That was done. The rest of her morning was her own. And no one thought twice about it. But then the hours started to pass. Jermaine tried to reach his mother. He called her, once, then again, and again. Each time the phone went straight to voicemail, not a busy signal, not a distracted, "Hey, I'll call you back," just silence. The flat, mechanical tone of a phone that was not being answered. He called again. Voicemail, again, voicemail. At first this might not have seemed alarming. People miss calls all the time. Phones die. People are busy. People are distracted. But Jermaine knew his mother. He knew that she was not the kind of woman who ignored her children's calls. Especially not his. And something about the silence on the other end of the line began to feel to him less like inconvenience and more like absence. But the afternoon came, and with it came the moment that turned this from a quiet worry into something much larger. Sharetha had never come back to pick up Glorious. 3 o'clock arrived, then 3:15, then 3:30. The school day ended, and Glorious's mother was not there. The staff at Earl Elementary waited. They looked around, they checked, and when Sharetha did not come, when the minutes stretched and no silver SUV pulled up to the curb, the school did what schools do in these situations. They contacted the family. It was that call, the call from the school, that changed everything. Aretha Miller, Sharetha's sister, received word that her sister's little girl was still at the school. And Aretha knew immediately that something was deeply, terribly wrong. Because Sharetha would never have left Glorious there. Not willingly. Not under any circumstance. As Aretha would later say, Sharetha would never have left her niece at that school. It simply was not something she would do. The school eventually took Glorious to a police station to wait for her family. And it was at that moment, standing there, looking at her sister's small, confused daughter, that Aretha understood that this was not a case of a mother running late. Something had had to Sharetha. The family began to make calls. They drove to Sharetha's home. When they arrived, the doors were open, but Sharetha was not inside. Her phone was not answering. She was not at work. She was not at a friend's house. She was simply gone. A missing persons report was filed with the Chicago Police Department, and the waiting began. For the next few days, the Morrison family lived in a kind of suspended dread, that particular anguish of not knowing. Every phone call might be the one that brought answers. Every knock at the door might change everything. But the hours passed, and then the days passed, and Sharetha did not come home, and did not call, and did not reach out in any way whatsoever. And then on Monday, March 1st, 3 days after Sharetha had last been seen, something happened that should have been a breakthrough. But instead, it only deepened the mystery. Someone, it is not entirely clear whether it was a friend of Sharetha's or another member of the community, contacted Aretha Miller and told her that Sharetha's car had been found. The silver Porsche Cayenne. It had been spotted parked in a tow zone near the intersection of Birchwood and Winchester Avenue in the 7400 block of North Winchester Avenue. Now here is what made this discovery so strange, so unsettling to the family. The Morrisons lived on the south side of Chicago. Englewood, where Sharetha had dropped her daughter off at school, is on the south side, but Winchester and Birchwood, that intersection, is in Rogers Park, a neighborhood on the far north side of the city, near the northern limits of Chicago itself. The car had been found roughly 20 to 21 miles away from where Sharetha had last been seen. That is not a short drive. That is not a quick errand. That is a deliberate distance, a distance that someone had to travel with intention. When the family learned where the car was, Aretha said she thought it was strange, because that area, Rogers Park, was not somewhere Sharetha frequented. It was not somewhere that made sense, and yet there was her sister's car, sitting in a tow zone on the north side of the city, as if it had been left there quickly and carelessly, the way someone might park if they were making a fast stop. A brief errand intending to come right back, but Sharitha never came back to it, and when police eventually recovered and examined the vehicle, what they found inside made the picture even more confusing. There was a substantial amount of cash sitting on the passenger seat. There was also a jacket. And according to early reports, a crowbar was found inside the SUV as well. No sign of Sharitha, no sign of a struggle, no blood, no obvious evidence of violence. Just her possessions, left behind in a car that had traveled 20 miles from where she was last seen. And a silence where there should have been answers. Relatives would later say that the car had been parked outside a residence Sharitha had visited before. But that detail, like so many others in this case, did not lead anywhere. The police took the vehicle into evidence, and they have held it ever since. As of the most recent reports, the Chicago Police Department still possesses the Porsche Cayenne, and Sharitha Morrison is still missing. Now, here's where the story takes on a quieter, more unsettling dimension, because it turns out that the day before Sharitha disappeared, Thursday, February 25th, something had already been wrong. That evening, Sharitha had been on the phone, and she had been arguing with someone. The argument was heated enough that family members noticed it. Sharitha Miller would later tell reporters that her sister had been having arguments with someone over the phone. The night before she vanished, the identity of the person on the other end of that call has never been publicly confirmed. At least not in any information made available to the press or to the public. Friends and people close to Sharitha have said, in the years since her disappearance, that she was involved in what they described as a toxic relationship. The word toxic is one that gets used often, and sometimes loosely, but in this context it carried weight. People who knew Sharitha suggested that there was someone in her life, a relationship that was not healthy, that there was tension, that there were problems. But here is what makes this thread so frustrating for the family. The police have never publicly stated whether they suspect foul play. They have never publicly named a person of interest. They have never confirmed whether the argument on the phone the night before is connected to what happened the following morning. And Sharitha Miller has said repeatedly over the years that she has asked the police for the phone records. She has asked for them more than once, and for a long time those records were not made available to her. So the family was left to wonder, who was Sharitha arguing with? Was it the same person she was involved with? Did that person know something? Did something happen in the hours between that argument and the moment Sharitha drove away from Earl Elementary the next morning? These questions have hung over this case like smoke, visible, persistent, and possible to clear away for years. In the days and weeks after Sharitha's disappearance, the Chicago Police Department opened an active investigation. The case was assigned to the Area 1 Special Victims Unit, a detective unit that handles cases involving vulnerable individuals, including missing persons. On paper, the investigation was underway. Detectives were looking into it. But from the family's perspective, progress was almost non-existent. The family organized their own search crews in the days following the disappearance, hoping to find some lead, any lead that might point them in the right direction. They searched the Rogers Park neighborhood where the car had been found. They searched the streets of Englewood. They knocked on doors. They asked questions. They did everything they could think of to find Sharitha, and still nothing. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into a year, and then 2 years. And the case remained cold. Sharitha Miller spoke to the media at every opportunity she could find. She went to events. She tried to get meetings with city officials. She contacted journalists. She did everything in her power to keep Sharitha's name in the public eye, to remind people that her sister was still out there, or that someone somewhere knew what had happened to her. But the leads did not come. The breaks did not happen, and the silence from the investigation continued. The disappearance of Sharitha Morrison did not just leave a gap where a person used to be. It tore through the fabric of an entire family, quietly, persistently, in ways that are difficult to fully articulate but impossible to ignore. Sharitha Miller took on the responsibility of raising Glorious, her sister's young daughter. Every day she looked after a child who was growing up without her mother. A child who asked about her mom constantly, who wanted to know where she was, who could not understand why the woman who had loved her most in the world had simply stopped coming home. Glorious asked about her mother every single day. Every day. Not once a week. Not once in a while. Every day. All day the way only a small child can, with a persistent aching need that never quite goes away, no matter how many times you try to explain it gently. And Jermaine, Sharetha's son, who was 20 when his mother disappeared, carried his own wound. He had been the one trying to reach her that morning. He had been the one whose calls went unanswered. He had been the one who pleaded to the public, through NBC Chicago, simply asking them to find his mom. "Just find my mom, please," he said. A young man on camera asking the world to help him find the woman who had brought him into it. Another family member, Larenita Starks, a niece of Morrison's, spoke about the toll it took on everyone. She said that for the oldest child, it was rough, deeply rough, to live without a mother. "I don't know how people can live without their mom," she said. And that sentence carries a weight that is difficult to shake. The family held gatherings. They held vigils. They gathered at Daly Plaza in downtown Chicago on the anniversaries of Sharetha's disappearance. Once at the 2-year mark, again at the 4-year mark, standing together, holding signs, holding photographs of the woman they loved, and asking the world to pay attention. Artist Damon Lamar Reed created a painting of Sharetha Morrison, along with other missing women, to raise awareness about the disappearances of black women in Chicago. The painting was displayed at the Daly Center. It was a small gesture in a vast landscape of silence, but it was something, a face given back to a case that had become, for many, just another number in a long and troubling list. Sharetha Morrison's disappearance did not happen in isolation. It happened in a city, in a country where the disappearances and deaths of women of color are tragically far from uncommon. And it happened in a context where those cases often receive far less attention, far less urgency, and far less resolution than they deserve. Journalist John Founan investigated and wrote about what he called the Forgotten 51. 51 women of color in Chicago who had either disappeared or been killed and whose cases remained unsolved. Sharetha Morrison became part of that painful tapestry. Another name, another face, another story that the broader public had largely overlooked. Robin Calhoun, Morrison's niece, spoke about this directly and without apology. She said that she did not feel the police were doing enough. She said she did not feel they cared, and she tied that feeling explicitly to race, to the reality as she saw it that cases involving black women in Chicago were not being treated with the same urgency or the same investment as others. Her words were not spoken in anger alone. They were spoken in grief, in frustration born from years of waiting, in the knowledge that her aunt, a pregnant woman, a mother of 2, had been missing for years, and that the investigation had not produced answers. Oritha Miller echoed this sentiment. She said that the sheer volume of missing persons cases in Chicago made it difficult for any single case to receive the attention it needed. Too many cases, too few resources, too little public pressure, and so cases like Sharetha's fell through the cracks. Not because no one cared, but because the system was overwhelmed, and the voices of the families were not loud enough to be heard above the noise. In January of 2025, nearly 4 years after Sharetha Morrison had vanished, the Chicago Police Department did something unusual. They reissued a missing persons bulletin for Sharetha. A fresh bulletin, an updated one, as if to say, "We have not forgotten this case. We are still looking. We still need your help." It was a rare move. Missing persons bulletins are typically issued once at the time of the disappearance, and then the case moves into the quiet machinery of investigation. To reissue one after nearly 4 years was a signal, an acknowledgement that the case had gone cold, that the leads had dried up, and that the only way forward might be for someone in the public to come forward with information. The bulletin reminded the public of the details. Sharetha Morrison, last seen February 26, 2021. Inglewood neighborhood. Silver Porsche Cayenne. Found in Rogers Park. Pregnant. Missing. Still unaccounted for. And in February of 2025, on the 4th anniversary of her disappearance, her family once again spoke to the press. Oritha Miller stood before cameras and said that 4 years had passed with no closure. She said her hope that Sharetha was still alive had faded, that she had begun to accept the possibility that her sister was no longer with them. But even so, she said she wanted answers. She wanted peace. She wanted, at the very least, to bring her sister home, even if that meant bringing her home in a way no one ever wanted to imagine. This has been a hard 4 years for me and my family. she said, to not have no closure on my sister. The family's plea remained the same as it had been from the very beginning. If you know something, anything, please come forward. Please help us find Sharetha. So let us take stock of what we know, and what remains shrouded in uncertainty. We know that Sharetha Morrison dropped her daughter off at Earl Elementary School on the morning of February 26, 2021. We know she drove away from that school. We know she never arrived where she was supposed to go next. We know her phone stopped working or stopped being answered, and never rang again in any way that connected her to the people who loved her. We know her car was found 3 days later, 20 miles away, in a tow zone in Rogers Park. We know there was cash in the car. We know there was a jacket. We know there was, according to at least one early report, a crowbar. We know relatives believed the car had been parked near a place Sharetha had visited before. We know that the night before she disappeared, she had been arguing with someone on the phone. We know that friends described her as being in a toxic relationship. We know that police have never publicly identified a suspect or a person of interest. We know that police have never publicly stated whether they believe foul play was involved. Though the classification of her case as endangered missing and the fact that the investigation was assigned to the Special Victims Unit suggest that authorities do take the possibility seriously. We know that the Chicago Police Department still holds her vehicle. We know that the case has remained unsolved for over 4 years. We know that in January of 2025, police reissued her missing persons bulletin, an unusual step that suggests they are still actively hoping for a break. And we know that Sharetha Morrison has not been found. Not alive. Not dead. She has simply disappeared, vanished from a city of nearly 3 million people on an ordinary Friday morning, and left no trail that anyone has been able to follow. The authorities do not believe she left of her own accord. That is an important statement. It means that officially, the working assumption is that Sharetha did not choose to disappear, that something or someone took her away from her life against her will. But what that something was, or who that someone might be, that remains as of today, a mystery without an answer. And so, we are left here, in the quiet of this story's end, with a question that has no resolution, a question that Sharetha's family has been asking for years now, in the dark, in the silence, in the space where answers should be, but are not. Where is Sharetha Morrison? She was a mother. She was a sister. She was a woman who tattooed the names of the people she loved onto her skin, because she wanted to carry them with her always. She was pregnant with her 3rd child on the morning she disappeared. She was 38 years old, and she was last seen driving away from her daughter's school on a cold February morning in Chicago, and she never came back. Somewhere in this city, or beyond it, there is an answer. Someone knows something. Someone saw something. Someone holds a piece of this puzzle that could bring this family the peace they have been searching for. The peace that has eluded them for over 4 years now. If you have any information, any at all, about what happened to Sharetha Morrison, the Chicago Police Department's Area 1 Special Victims Unit is still investigating. They can be reached. Tonight, as you drift off, carry her name with you for a moment. Sharetha. A name that deserves to be remembered. A story that deserves an ending. And may you sleep gently, knowing that somewhere out there, a family is still hoping, still waiting, still searching for one of their own. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 6. Tonight I am going to take you somewhere. Not somewhere far away, exactly. I am going to take you back to a small town in the deep south of Georgia. A town called Valdosta, a place where the summers are long and sticky and the high school is the center of everything. The pride, the football, the friendships, all of it. And I am going to tell you about a boy who lived there. A boy who smiled a lot. A boy who dreamed of playing football for the rest of his life. His name was Kendrick Johnson, and what happened to him is one of the strangest, most unsettling stories in recent American history. Valdosta, Georgia is not a big town. It sits in the far southern part of the state, close enough to the Florida border that some people joke it belongs there. It is a quiet place, the kind of town where people know their neighbors, where high school football games fill up the stands on Friday nights, and where life moves at a pace that feels almost untouched by the rest of the world. Lounded's High School sits right in the heart of that community. It is the school where the athletes train, where the marching band plays, and where kids spend their mornings dreaming about what comes next. For many of them, what comes next is everything. Kendrick Lamar Johnson was born on the 10th of October, 1995. He grew up in Valdosta, and Loudon's High School was his school. By the time he was 17 years old, people who knew him would tell you the same things. They would say he was sweet. They would say he was quiet in a good way. Not the kind of quiet that comes from shyness, but the kind that comes from someone who is thoughtful, someone who listens more than he speaks. And when he does speak, people tend to pay attention. He was athletic. Not in the way that makes people roll their eyes, but in the way that made coaches notice him. He played football. He played basketball. He was involved in track free sports. 3 different seasons of the year spent moving, competing, pushing his body to see what it could do. And Kendrick had a dream. It was not a complicated one. He wanted to play college football. He wanted to keep going. He wanted his athletic career to be more than just high school hallways and Friday night games under the lights. He wanted it to last. By all accounts, he was on his way. His family loved him. His mother, Jacqueline Johnson, and his father, Kenneth Johnson, were a part of his life in the way that matters. Present, involved, paying attention. He had siblings. He had cousins. He had a family that gathered and laughed and held each other close, the way families in small southern towns often do. Kendrick Johnson was, by every measure that counts, a young man with a future. And then, in January of 2013, that future ended. The 10th of January, 2013 was a Thursday. A regular school day in Valdosta, the kind of day that should have passed without anyone remembering it at all. The morning came and went. Students filtered into Lowndes High School the way they always did. Backpacks slung over shoulders, earbuds in. Conversations drifting from one hallway to the next. It was an ordinary morning. Somewhere in the middle of the day, around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, surveillance cameras inside the school captured an image. It was Kendrick Johnson walking at a quick pace through one of the school's corridors. He was heading toward the old gymnasium, the one on the far side of the building. The one that had been used for years by athletes and students alike. He walked in. He disappeared from the frame of the camera, and he was never seen alive again. That evening when Kendrick did not come home, his parents filed a missing persons report. They were worried. A 17-year-old boy does not simply vanish from his own school without a reason. But the report was logged, and the night passed, and the worry turned into something heavier. The kind of fear that settles into a family when the phone does not ring and the door does not open. The next morning, the 11th of January, students arrived at Lowndes High School for another day of classes. Some of them wandered into the gymnasium. A group of girls climbed up onto the top of a cluster of rolled-up wrestling mats that were stacked vertically near the bleachers. The mats stood nearly 6 feet tall, thick and heavy, the kind that gymnasts and wrestlers train on. And then one of them looked down into the center of one of the mats and saw something that made her scream. A body, head first, pressed deep into the hollow center of the rolled-up mat. Still, unmoved, it was Kendrick. The gymnasium was put into lockdown almost immediately. Teachers were called. The sheriff's office was contacted. Emergency services arrived. The school was sealed, and within hours, the story began to spread. Not just through Valdosta, but outward, in the way that terrible news does when it involves a young person. A 17-year-old boy had been found dead inside a gym mat at his own school. The Lowndes County Sheriff's Office moved quickly. Within roughly 24 hours of Kendrick's body being discovered, investigators had already begun to piece together what they believed had happened. Their theory was this: Kendrick had gone into the old gymnasium sometime on the afternoon of January 10th. He had been looking for a pair of sneakers, athletic shoes that he had at some earlier point stored inside, or near the mats. This was apparently not unusual. Multiple students told investigators that it was common practice at the school to stash shoes, books, or other belongings near or inside the gym mats to avoid paying for a locker. Several of Kendrick's own classmates confirmed that they had done this themselves. and that Kendrick had done it too. The sheriff's office believed that Kendrick had reached down into the center of the vertical mat to retrieve one of his shoes. That in doing so, he had leaned too far in, lost his balance, and slipped headfirst into the narrow hollow core of the mat, and that he had become trapped, stuck upside down, and was unable to pull himself back out. And that, trapped in that position, he had suffocated. The term they used was positional asphyxia. It meant that the position of his body, inverted, compressed, locked into a space that left no room for his chest to expand, had cut off his ability to breathe. Not violently, not dramatically, just slowly, quietly, in the dark in a gymnasium where no one could hear him. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the GBI, conducted the first autopsy on Kendrick's body on the 14th of January, just 3 days after he was found. Their medical examiner reviewed the body, examined the injuries, and released a report several weeks later that confirmed the sheriff's theory. The cause of death, according to the GBI, was positional asphyxia. The manner of death was accidental. Case closed. At least that is what the official record said. Lieutenant Stride Jones, who led the investigation for the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office, spoke publicly about the conclusion. He stated plainly that investigators had never come across any credible information that pointed to anything other than a tragic accident. And for a little while that was the end of the story, but it was not the end. Not even close. From the very beginning, something did not feel right to the people closest to Kendrick. His parents, Kenneth and Jacqueline Johnson, looked at the sheriff's story and saw things that troubled them. Small things at first. Details that did not sit well. One of the first things they noticed was a discrepancy in the initial medical reports. When paramedics arrived at the scene on the morning of January 11th, they documented what they observed about Kendrick's body before anyone else touched it. In their report, the very first official record of his condition, they noted bruising on the right side of Kendrick's jaw. But when the GBI autopsy report came out weeks later, that bruising was not mentioned. It was simply absent from the official findings. The Johnsons asked themselves why. They asked others why, and no one gave them a satisfying answer. There were other things too. The mat that Kendrick was found in, when it was rolled up and standing vertically, the hollow center that ran through it was roughly 14 inches across. 14 inches. And Kendrick Johnson was 5 feet and 10 inches tall, with shoulders that measured 19 inches wide. The Johnsons looked at those numbers and felt something cold settle in their chests. 19 inches of shoulder width, 14 inches of opening. Their son, a young athlete, strong and broad, had supposedly squeezed himself headfirst into a space that was narrower than his own body. Gone deep enough to get completely stuck and never been able to pull himself back up. It was not impossible. A person can compress their shoulders, shift their body, maneuver in ways that surprise you. But to the Johnsons, it felt unlikely. It felt, to put it the way they put it, wrong. And then there was the shoe. The shoe that Kendrick was supposedly reaching for when he fell. A black and white gym shoe was found on the ground below the mat, on the ground. Not inside it. And near that shoe, on the floor, was a pool of blood. Blood on the floor. Blood that had apparently dripped down from Kendrick's body. Because when someone dies upside down, blood rushes to the head, and eventually it bleeds out through the nose and mouth. The blood had pooled on the ground around the shoe. But here's the detail that made people stop and stare. The shoe itself was dry. There was blood all around it, pooled beneath it, pooled beside it. But there was no blood on the shoe. Not a drop. If Kendrick had been reaching for that shoe when he fell, how had the shoe ended up below the mat, sitting clean and dry in a pool of his own blood? The Johnsons did not have an answer, but the question stayed with them. And it stayed with a lot of other people, too. By the spring of 2013, the Johnsons had made a decision. They were not going to accept the GBI's findings without challenge. They were going to get a second opinion. They filed the necessary paperwork. A judge granted them permission to have Kendrick's body exhumed from the ground. And in the early days of June, his remains were carefully lifted from the earth and transported to Florida, where a private pathologist named Dr. William Anderson, a forensic specialist working out of a firm called Forensic Dimensions in Heathrow, was waiting to perform an independent autopsy. What Dr. Anderson found changed everything. He examined Kendrick's body with the kind of care and precision that comes from someone who understands that the details matter. That in cases like this, single finding can shift the entire shape of a story. And when he was finished, he sat down and wrote his report. The findings were stark, Dr. Anderson detected hemorrhaging, bleeding on the right side of Kendrick Johnson's neck. Not the kind of damage that comes from being stuck in a mat. Not the kind of injury that positional asphyxia creates. This was blunt force trauma. Someone or something had struck Kendrick in the neck hard, on the right side, near the jaw. Dr. Anderson's conclusion was clear. Kendrick Johnson, in his professional opinion, had not died from accidentally falling into a gym mat. He had died from what Anderson described as unexplained, apparent non-accidental, blunt force trauma. The word non-accidental sat on the page like a stone. And then Dr. Anderson opened up the body cavity to continue his work, and discovered something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with how Kendrick died, and everything to do with what had happened to him afterward. When a person dies and an autopsy is performed, there is a standard procedure. The medical examiner removes the internal organs. The heart, the lungs, the liver, the brain, all of it, examines them carefully for signs of disease or injury, and then places them back inside the body before it is released to the family. It is routine. It is expected. It is how it is supposed to work. Dr. Anderson opened Kendrick Johnson's body, and the organs were not there. Not some of them, not a few, all of them. Every organ from the top of his skull down to his pelvis. Gone. The heart, the lungs, the liver, the brain. Every single one. In their place, filling the hollow cavity of the teenage boy's chest and abdomen, was newspaper, crumpled sheets of newsprint, Black Friday advertisements, department store circulars, pages from the kind of junk mail that arrives in everyone's mailbox and gets thrown away without a second glance, stuffed inside the body of a 17-year-old boy like packing material. When the Johnsons learned what had been found, Kenneth Johnson said something that has stayed with people who heard it. He said, "When we buried Kendrick, we thought we were burying Kendrick, not half of Kendrick." Now the question obviously was this: where did the organs go? And who put the newspaper in? Two entities had custody of Kendrick's body between the time of the first autopsy and the time of the burial. The first was the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, which performed the initial autopsy. The second was the Harrington Funeral Home in Valdosta, which prepared the body for burial. The GBI's spokesperson told reporters that after the autopsy was completed, the organs were placed back inside Kendrick's body. The body was closed and it was released to the funeral home. That, she said, was standard procedure. But the funeral home told a different story. The owner, a man named Antonio Harrington, wrote a letter to the Johnsons' attorney saying that his funeral home never received the organs. He said they had been, in his words, destroyed through natural process and discarded before the body arrived in Valdosta. The two accounts could not both be true. Someone was not telling the truth. The Georgia Secretary of State's office opened an investigation into the funeral home's handling of the body. Their review ultimately found that the funeral home had not followed best practices, that stuffing a body with newspaper was not an acceptable method, and that other materials like cotton or sawdust would have been more appropriate. But the organs themselves, the ones that could have been tested, the ones that might have told a clearer story about how Kendrick died, were gone, and they were never recovered. It was for the Johnsons. Another door closing in a hallway that already felt very dark. There was something else too, something quieter, and in some ways more unsettling, because it happened so early in the process that most people did not notice it until much later. When a body is released after an autopsy, it typically comes back to the family accompanied by a bag of personal effects, the clothes the person was wearing, any jewelry, anything that was on them when they died. This is standard. This is expected. On the day that Kendrick's body was released from the GBI lab back to Valdosta, the funeral home received two bodies that had been processed that same day. One of those bodies came with its clothing. The other, Kendrick's, did not. All that accompanied him was a pair of broken headphones. His clothes were gone. Just like that. Somewhere between the autopsy lab in Macon and the funeral home in Valdosta, the clothing Kendrick had been wearing on the day he died had disappeared. The Johnsons believed, and still believed, that those clothes might have contained evidence. Fibers, DNA, signs of a physical struggle, the kind of material that forensic scientists use to piece together what really happened in the moments before someone died. And it was simply not there anymore. No one ever explained where the clothing went, and no one was ever held accountable for its disappearance. If there was one thing that might have settled the question of what happened to Kendrick Johnson, one single piece of evidence that could have shown the world Clearly and without ambiguity, whether he fell into that mat or whether someone put him there. It was the surveillance cameras. Lowndes High School had a surveillance system. Cameras mounted throughout the building, recording the hallways, the entrances, the common areas. 35 cameras in total, covering the gym area and the corridors that led to it. And in November of 2013, roughly 10 months after Kendrick's death, 290 hours of that surveillance footage were released to CNN following a court request. A forensic video analyst was brought in to review the tapes. What he found was troubling. The footage was jumpy. Students appeared and vanished between frames, as if parts of the video had simply been removed or skipped over. There were no clear timestamps on certain segments, making it difficult to place events in order. And most significantly, there were gaps. 2 cameras were missing 1 hour and 5 minutes of footage. Another set was missing 2 hours and 10 minutes. The Johnsons' attorneys looked at those gaps and immediately suspected tampering. Someone, he suggested, had gone into the system and edited the footage, removed the parts that mattered, the parts that might have shown what really happened in the gym that afternoon. Now, there were explanations offered for at least some of these anomalies. The school's surveillance system was not one unified network. It was made up of multiple camera systems that were not synchronized with one another. Timestamps on different cameras could differ by as much as 20 minutes. For the same moment in time, which meant that what looked like a gap in the footage was sometimes just a mismatch between 2 systems, recording at slightly different speeds. Some of the missing footage was also attributed to the camera's motion-activated function. The cameras did not record continuously. They recorded when they detected movement, specifically when a change in light pixels triggered them to turn on. If no movement was detected, the camera simply did not record, and the area where the mats were stored, the exact spot where Kendrick's body was found, was not directly covered by any camera at all. So there were technical explanations, but they did not erase the persistent nagging feeling that the full picture of what happened that afternoon had somehow been lost. Or take it. The police received a copy of the surveillance footage several days after Kendrick's body was found. The Johnsons' attorneys noted this delay and found it suspicious. A forensic analyst who reviewed the tapes told CNN that he found it highly suspicious that footage could be missing, particularly given the way in which the material had been acquired by investigators. The cameras had been there. They had been recording. And somewhere in all of that footage, in all of those hours of captured images, was the story of what happened to Kendrick Johnson on the afternoon of January 10th. But that story, it seemed, was not going to be told easily. As the questions mounted, the bruising that was left out of the report, the second autopsy that pointed to blunt force trauma, the missing organs, the gaps in the video, a new thread began to emerge in the story, and it involved 2 brothers who attended Lowndes High School at the same time as Kendrick. Their names were Brian Bell and Brandon Bell. They were white. They were classmates of Kendrick's. And the Johnson family came to believe, and stated publicly that these 2 brothers were responsible for Kendrick's death. The Johnsons' theory was specific. They believed that Brian and Brandon Bell had lured Kendrick into the gymnasium, that the brothers had physically attacked him, that the blunt force trauma Dr. Anderson found in the second autopsy was the result of that attack, and that afterwards someone, the boys or others connected to them, had placed Kendrick's body into the mat to make it look like an accident. And the reason, the Johnsons alleged, that the investigation had moved so quickly toward the conclusion of accidental death, the reason that questions were not being asked and evidence was not being followed, was because of who the Bell brothers' father was. His name was Rick Bell, and he was an FBI agent. The Johnsons believed that Rick Bell's position with the FBI gave his sons a layer of protection, an invisible shield that shielded them from serious scrutiny. They believed that the investigation had been shaped, consciously or not, by the knowledge that the people at the center of the suspicion had a father with federal law enforcement connections. It was a serious allegation, and it drew national attention, but the Bell brothers denied everything. They said they had nothing to do with Kendrick's death. They said they had not seen him that day in the way the Johnsons claimed. And over the course of the investigation, evidence emerged that supported their account, at least in part. In September of 2014, the FBI conducted its own analysis of the Lowndes High School surveillance footage. It was a thorough review, carried out at FBI headquarters in Quantico, Virginia. And when the report was released, it contained a finding that was difficult to argue with. The analysis concluded that on the afternoon of January 10th, 2013, the afternoon Kendrick walked into the old gymnasium for the last time. Both Brian Bell and Brandon Bell were in different parts of the school. Brian Bell, according to the FBI's review of the cameras, was walking along the exterior of the school building, heading toward a classroom wing on the opposite side of campus at the same time Kendrick was entering the old gym. The two of them were not in the same play, they were moving in opposite directions. And Brandon Bell, the older brother, was not even in the building. He was on a bus that was traveling to Macon, Georgia for a wrestling tournament. Phone records and official documents confirmed this. Brandon Bell had an alibi that placed him miles away from the school at the time of Kendrick's death. The FBI's conclusion was stated plainly in their report. Kendrick Johnson and the two persons of interest, Brian and Brandon Bell, were in different areas of the LHS campus during the time in question. It did not prove that the Bells had nothing to do with what happened to Kendrick, but it significantly weakened the Johnsons' theory about the circumstances of that afternoon. Rick Bell, the brother's father, eventually resigned from the FBI. His home was raided and searched as part of the investigation, but neither brother was ever charged with the crime in connection with Kendrick's death. By the end of 2013, the case had grown far beyond the borders of Valdosta. It had become a national story. Civil rights organizations were involved. The NAACP had weighed in. Rallies had been held at the Georgia State Capitol in Atlanta. The name Kendrick Johnson was being spoken in the same breath as other cases that had come to represent broader questions about race, justice, and how young black lives were treated in America. The family retained the services of Benjamin Crump, one of the most prominent civil rights attorneys in the country, a man who had been involved in the cases of Trayvon Martin and other high-profile deaths. Crump's involvement brought even more visibility to the case, but he later withdrew from representing the family, and the reasons for that were never made entirely public. On the 31st of October, 2013, the United States Attorney for the Middle District of Georgia, a man named Michael Moore, announced that his office would open a formal review into Kendrick Johnson's death. It was a significant step. It meant that federal eyes were now on the case. Federal investigators, federal resources, the full weight of the Department of Justice, looking at what had happened in that gymnasium. The investigation that followed was extensive. Federal lawyers and investigators interviewed nearly 100 people. They reviewed tens of thousands of emails and text messages. They went through the surveillance footage from the school. They consulted with independent medical examiners, including one from the Department of Defense, and had a separate forensic pathologist review both autopsy reports side by side. And on the 20th of June 2016, roughly 3.5 years after Kendrick's body was found, the Department of Justice released its conclusion they would not be filing any criminal charges. The statement from the DOJ was carefully worded. They said that after an extensive investigation, federal investigators had determined that there was insufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone or some group of people willfully violated Kendrick Johnson's civil rights or committed any other prosecutable federal crime. They also acknowledged in that statement the particular challenge of bringing a federal civil rights case. To prosecute under that framework, the government would have needed to prove not only that someone had killed Kendrick, but that the killing had been motivated by racial animus. That is an extraordinarily high bar, and the DOJ said they could not meet it. It was a devastating blow to the Johnsons. They had waited years for this review. They had believed deeply that the federal government would find what the local sheriff had not, and instead they received a letter that said, in essence, "We looked, we could not find enough." The Johnsons did not stop. In 2015, they filed a civil lawsuit, a $100 million suit against 38 individuals and entities. The defendants included the Bell brothers, law enforcement agents, the high school, the crime laboratory, and others. The suit alleged that Kendrick had been murdered, and that everyone named in the lawsuit had participated in a conspiracy to cover up that murder. It was an ambitious legal action, and it did not survive. In August of 2017, a Georgia judge named Richard Porter ruled against the Johnsons. He ordered them and their attorney to pay more than $292,000 in legal fees to the defendants. In his ruling, Judge Porter wrote that the testimony presented showed that the Johnsons had no evidence to support their claims, that the Bell brothers had killed Kendrick, or that any of the other defendants had engaged in a conspiracy to conceal the cause or manner of his death. The lawsuit was withdrawn. The family was left with a court order to pay the other side's legal costs. It was in many ways the lowest point in a long and painful fight. But even then, even after the federal investigation closed, even after the lawsuit failed, even after the judge's harsh words, the Johnsons did not stop asking questions. Because there was a third autopsy still to come. In June of 2018, Kendrick Johnson's body was exhumed for the second time. A third independent autopsy was performed, once again by a forensic team working on behalf of the family. The results were consistent with what Dr. Anderson had found 5 years earlier. The third autopsy concluded that Kendrick had died from what it described as apparent non-accidental blunt force trauma. Specifically, trauma to the right side of his neck and to the right side of his thorax, which is the area of the chest. Once again, the finding contradicted the GBI's original conclusion of accidental positional asphyxia. And once again, it confirmed the presence of injuries that the family believed were inconsistent with a boy simply falling into a mat. The third autopsy also noted, once more, that certain organs were missing from the body. A detail that had never been satisfactorily resolved, no matter how many explanations were offered. 3 autopsies. 2 of them pointed in one direction. 1 pointed in another. And the question of which account was correct, the official story or the one the family believed, remained, as it had for years, unanswered. In March of 2021, something happened that reignited the case in a way that surprised many people. The new sheriff of Lowndes County, a man named Ashley Polk, who had not been in office when Kendrick died, announced that he was officially reopening the investigation. He had received documents from the federal government, documents that had previously been sealed, and he wanted to review them personally. Polk had something else too. Something unusual. He put up a reward. $500,000 of his own personal money for any information that could lead to the conviction of someone who had killed Kendrick Johnson. It was an extraordinary gesture. It suggested that Polk, at least at the outset, took the possibility of foul play seriously enough to back it with his own finances. He and 2 other investigators spent 13 months going through the case. 17 boxes of evidence. The autopsy reports, the surveillance footage, the witness statements, the federal documents, all of it, piece by piece. And in January of 2022, Sheriff Polk released his conclusion. There had been no homicide, he said. No cover-up, no conspiracy. The death of Kendrick Johnson, in Polk's assessment, was, and always had been, a tragic and bizarre accident. Polk was careful in how he delivered that finding. He acknowledged that there would still be people who believed otherwise. He encouraged anyone who wanted to form an opinion to study all of the evidence before doing so. And he stated clearly that he did not believe the original investigation had been flawed or that the original conclusion had been wrong. The case was closed. Again, but the Johnsons did not close their eyes. Even after Sheriff Polk's conclusion, even after the Department of Justice closed its investigation, even after the lawsuit was dismissed and the family was ordered to pay legal fees, even after all of that, Kenneth and Jacqueline Johnson kept going. They kept filing. They kept pushing. They kept asking the same questions they had been asking since the morning their son's body was found in that mat. Questions that for them had never been answered. Not really. Not in a way that felt like the truth. In the years that followed, new legal actions were filed. New motions were brought before new courts. The family invoked Georgia's Coleman-Baker Act, a law that created a process for the GBI to reinvestigate cold case murders, and applied to have the case formally reclassified and reopened under that framework. They filed a lawsuit challenging the death certificate itself. They argued that the official cause of death, accidental positional asphyxia, had been scientifically disproven by the independent autopsies. They presented photographs. They presented the findings of forensic pathologists. They presented the collapsed carotid artery that one expert said was consistent with intentional harm. Kenneth Johnson, speaking to reporters, said something that carried the weight of 12 years of grief and frustration. He said, "All I have to say is pictures don't lie. People do." A federal appeals court, in a ruling that came years after the original lawsuit was dismissed, found that the dismissal should be reconsidered. The door, it seemed, had not closed all the way after all. There were still legal avenues, still possibilities, still reasons to keep fighting. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation, for its part, has maintained its position. They have said publicly and repeatedly that they stand behind their original autopsy findings. The case, in their view, is closed. But for the Johnsons, it is not. It has never been. And so we come to the place where this story lives now. Not in a courtroom, not in a sheriff's report, but in the quiet space between what was proven and what was never fully explained. There are questions that remain. Questions about the bruising on the right side of Kendrick's jaw, that the paramedics documented but that disappeared from the official autopsy. Questions about the 2 independent autopsies that found blunt force trauma, where the GBI found only asphyxia. Questions about the organs that were removed and never returned. Organs that could have been tested, examined, and compared against the findings of multiple pathologists, but that were gone before anyone thought to ask where they were. Questions about the clothing that vanished somewhere between the autopsy lab and the funeral home. Questions about the gaps in the surveillance footage, the missing hours, the jumpy frames, the camera that was pointed at the mat area but recorded nothing useful. Questions about how quickly the case was closed and by whom, and what was said in the rooms where those decisions were made. And questions, the deepest ones, the ones that sit in the center of everything, about whether a 17-year-old boy with shoulders 19 inches wide really did squeeze himself head first into a space 14 inches across, in a gymnasium where no one saw him, and no camera captured the moment, simply died there, alone in the quiet of an empty room. There are people who believe the official story, people who looked at the evidence, all of it, including the FBI video analysis, including Sheriff Paul's 13-month review, and concluded that Kendrick Johnson's death was exactly what it was ruled to be, a terrible, improbable, heartbreaking accident. And there are people who do not believe that. People who looked at the same evidence and saw something else, a story that was shaped from the very beginning by forces that did not want the truth to come out. Cover-up. A conspiracy, a boy who was killed, and whose death was hidden in plain sight. Neither side has been able to prove their case beyond all doubt. And so the story remains exactly where it has been for over 12 years now. Suspended, unresolved, alive in the minds of everyone who has followed it. And that is where we will leave it tonight. The case of Kendrick Johnson is not a story with a neat ending. There is no villain who was caught. There is no moment of revelation where the truth finally came flooding into the light. There is only the story itself, complicated, painful, and still in many ways unfinished. What I hope you carry with you tonight, not as a worry, not as something heavy, but as a quiet thought, is this. There was a boy, a real boy, with a real name, and a real family, and a real dream. And something happened to him that the people who loved him most have never been able to fully understand or accept. His mother still fights for him. His father still speaks his name in courtrooms and in front of cameras and in the quiet of their home. They have not stopped. They may never stop. And somewhere in Valdosta, Georgia, in a small town at the bottom of the map, the story of Kendrick Johnson is still being told, still being whispered about, still being wondered over by people who remember him, and by people who never met him but who heard his name and could not look away. So tonight, as you drift off, let that story rest gently beside you. You do not have to solve it. You do not have to carry it. Just know it is there, and that it matters. Good night. Take care of yourself, and sleep well.